Well, I always get excited about a new series, and we're going to start one today. A little 3-part series, comparing 3 songs in Scripture. And this is a series that started out just was going to be this one lesson, and as I am wont to do sometimes, these things grow until they encompass a little bit more. We're going to be studying from 1 Samuel chapter 2 this morning about Hannah's song. And we'll stick to that context today. But then next week we are going to compare Hannah's song at the beginning of 1 Samuel with David's song at the end of 2 Samuel and show how those bookend the book of Samuel. Really, it's just one book that we've split into 2. And that will provide some useful narrative information for the story of Samuel and the story of how Israel comes to have kings. Then, in 2 weeks' time, Lord willing, we will compare Hannah's song with the Magnificat, Mary's song in Luke chapter 1, and see how Mary expands on Hannah's idea with a greater fulfillment than anything Hannah could have dreamed of at that time. So I'm really looking forward to this. I hope you will as well. But for this morning, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 2, talking about Hannah's song. Now, all 3 of these songs are really prayers. You might be confused why I'm calling them songs. They really started out as prayers, but they have poetic and hymnic qualities and have been used throughout history as songs. So it is appropriate to call them prayers, to call them poetry, and to call them songs because they've been used in all of these various ways. And so in 1 Samuel 2, we'll see Hannah's reaction to a great blessing from God and the way that she praises God for this. So in 1 Samuel chapter 2, we'll read in verse 1, Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." Hannah's song begins in a very emotional place. And isn't that the case for every great song? I love that God made us with music in our hearts. I play piano. I'm not as much as I'd like to anymore. I am a musician, though. I've taught music in the past, not on the level that Steve does, I'm sure. But many of you here probably play music, sing music, or at least appreciate music. And it's not an accident. God made us musical. He made us to love and appreciate music for a specific reason. Music takes words, takes thoughts, takes emotions, and it expresses it in a way that simple words do not by themselves. I love narrative, I love prose, I love speaking, obviously, but music takes these things and it accentuates the emotion behind those words. Somehow music stirs our hearts more than the words do by themselves. And so it's no accident that our worship involves singing. We don't do that just because we find it fun. We do that because God commands us to sing to Him and to sing to each other. It's a really important part of what we do. Our singing glorifies God, it edifies one another, and it stirs community and connection and emotion behind what we are singing. It would not be quite the same if we replaced the singing with another sermon. The two are just not exactly the same thing. Even the heavenly host sings in the presence of Yahweh, and our voices will join theirs one day. So there's a lot to appreciate and love with singing. And the first line in Hannah's song is an explosion of joy. That's the emotion that she starts from. She says, "My heart exults in the Lord," or your translation might say, "My heart rejoices in the Lord." She is overwhelmingly happy because God heard and granted her plea. Now, what was her plea? Well, we're in 1 Samuel 2. If you read chapter 1, you learn what her plea, what her request was. Hannah desperately wanted a child. She wanted to be a mother. That was extremely important to her, as it is to many women, and she could not have a child. So she prayed to God. She asked, she begged, she pled with him, "Please give me a son, give me a child." And the Lord answered her prayer. God gave her Samuel. And in return, she dedicates that child's life in service of God. But Hannah recognizes that her joyful moment is not by chance, it is not mere happenstance, it is the direct result of God's blessing. How often do we beg God for help and then forget about him when he answers? When you pray to God, when something is urgent in your heart, when you ache with fear or anxiety or desire, and you ask God for what you need and then it comes, do you attribute that to God? I want to suggest to you that if you don't attribute that to God, if you don't thank him for what he has done for you, then you might not have a very good understanding of the power of prayer and the active involvement of God in your life. God does hear our prayers, and God answers them, and many times God gives us what we ask for. Sometimes we focus a little bit too much on how God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we'd like, and God doesn't always do things on our timetable, but you know what? Sometimes he does. Sometimes he does say yes. Sometimes he does give us what we ask for, and even in the way that we ask for it. And it's okay to understand that and appreciate that and be happy about that. Like, God is not beholden to me for me to command him at my will, but he wants what is best for me. And he wants me to be happy, not in sinful and evil ways, but he does take care of me. And so when I pray to God and God answers that prayer, I ought to be happy and I ought to thank God for what he has done for me. Don't let yourself get disconnected from God's guidance and God's work. Be thankful and be happy when God does as you have pled with him and asked him. Hannah goes on to say, "My horn is exalted in the Lord." We don't often pray about our horns, but a horn is a symbol of power and strength in the Bible. See, it's funny. It is. There are funny things in the Bible. But a horn is a symbol. And it's probably best understood if you think about what a horn is to an animal. It's not decoration. It's not there just to look pretty. A horn is there as an expression of power. An animal that has a horn is stronger than the same animal without one. It is able to defend itself. It is able to attack. It is able to win a battle because that horn is a weapon. And so when Hannah says, "My horn is exalted in the Lord," she's saying, I am empowered. I am stronger because of the Lord. So the NIV says, "My horn is lifted high," and the NLT paraphrases it a little bit and just says, "The Lord has made me strong." And that's not literally what it says there, but that is the meaning, that God has made me strong. That's what Hannah is thankful for, that he saw her in her place of weakness and need, and he strengthened her. He made her strong. Well, she then goes on to say, my mouth derides my enemies. Hannah's enemies have been proven wrong. Who are these enemies? Well, primarily, there's one enemy who has been a plague upon Hannah's life. The previous chapter shows that Hannah was one of two wives of Elkanah. Peninnah, the other wife, is called her rival. And she taunted and provoked her because Hannah could not have children. That's a hard thing. It's a hard thing for most women, I think, if they are not able to have children. That maybe it doesn't bother everyone, but a lot it does bother. Now imagine if there's another wife. Your husband has another wife and she's perfectly capable of having children. That rivalry, that intensity of emotion is a very difficult thing to deal with. And Peninnah was not shy about telling Hannah that she was not a worthy wife. And that was a very terrible and sad thing for her to do. Yet this bothers Hannah. And she doesn't have a way to silence her. Her husband, Elkanah, to his credit, does try to make her feel better. And there's no indication that he is tormenting her about it. In fact, he tries to comfort her and to remind her that he loves her and that she means more to him than any number of children. But still, this is a problem for her, and her enemy, her rival, is holding this over her head and making her life difficult as a result. Well, now that Hannah has been given a child, her enemy has been silenced. Not because of anything Hannah could do or say, but because God has raised Hannah up. And so Hannah says, I rejoice in your salvation. Even though she is, talking a little bit about her rival here, her focus is not on her. Her focus is not on all the bad things that people have said to her or all the evil things people have thought about her. Her focus instead is on God's blessing. This is a time of rejoicing, not a time of bitterness and hatred. So notice all of the personal pronouns in this first verse. My heart, my horn, my mouth, I rejoice. Hannah's song begins in a very personal place, but it's not going to stay there for very long. We're going to move on to something bigger and better than that. In verses 2 and 3, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, we move on to that new thing. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. Hannah, you could imagine, if she were a little bit more self-centered, she could have taken the first part of this song, that verse 1, and continued on in some kind of self-indulgent, gleeful deluge against her rival, going on and on about how now she is actually better than Peninnah, or maybe whatever else she wants to say with that. But she quickly leaves that subject and instead keeps the focus on God. I think it's very natural for her to begin at her own emotion, but it's also natural and important for her to quickly transition to enthusiastic praise of the unique character of Yahweh. She says, there is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides you. God is uniquely and innately holy. To understand that, we need to know what holiness is. Holiness is the state of being separated or set apart for something unique, something higher and better. So we as disciples of Jesus are called to be holy. We are separated for a higher calling of serving God. Before I was a Christian, I could do whatever I wanted. I could be whoever I wanted. I live for Danny and Danny alone, or whatever else I feel is best. But after becoming a Christian, it is my job, my duty, my very purpose to put God first. That is the higher calling that we have as Christians. Hannah made her son Samuel holy by devoting him to service. So she very literally set him apart for that special purpose of serving the Lord. Remember, Samuel, even as a child, goes to be with Eli and to serve him as priest of the Lord. That's a literal setting apart, making holy. God's holiness is not like that. God's holiness is something bigger and better. He is holy like no one else is. He is separated from creation not because somebody gave him a higher calling, or even that he gave himself a higher calling. He is separated from creation because he is innately holy. By definition, God is above all creation in righteousness, in power, in nature, and in position. So no one can ever be the same kind of holy as God. That holiness is stable. Hannah says, there is no rock like our God. His holiness is a core part of what makes God God. It is part of his nature, and it doesn't ever change. And so because of this, Hannah offers a warning. She says, don't elevate yourself to challenge God. If God is infinitely holy, then it is foolish to put myself on equal ground with him. And that's probably something that we understand. But notice that Hannah takes this just a little bit further. The immediate context of this, of course, as we mentioned, is her rebuke of Peninnah, of her rival, that she has tormented Hannah. But the biggest crime and the biggest problem here is not that Peninnah has hurt Hannah, but actually that by elevating herself, she is challenging God. Now, there's nothing that says that Peninnah said, I am God, or overtly makes the claim, I am equal with God. However, she did class herself above Hannah. She said that she was inherently better because she could have children. And that is repugnant to God. We do this with many characteristics. The example here is being able to have children. Maybe that's not important to you, or maybe you are male and can't have children. And so you think, what does this have to do with me? Well, there are all sorts of ways that we class ourselves above each other. We do it in valuing those who are married above those who are single, those who have children or don't. We do it based on the standard of intelligence or education or wealth or social status or race or nationality, or generally wherever it is that you call home. And people get really fine-tuned with this on, you live on this side of this street, and so that makes you better than the person who lives on the other side of that street. We do it based off of skills and talents. I am good at something, but you are not good at, and so that makes me better than you. We do it off of the jobs that we have. And we generally have these problems with trying to rank ourselves and to come up with versions of classes or a ladder of sorts. And some cultures have that very overtly. They have a class system that is set and rigid, and you don't associate with people outside of your class. Or if you do, it's in very limited ways. But even if we don't do that quite so overtly, we do it in a lot of insidious ways. we have a lot of ways of reassuring ourselves that I am better than that person. And that makes me feel good. Basically, we find reasons to elevate ourselves and to denigrate those around us. This is not harmless behavior. It's not harmless even if you never say anything of the sort to the person that you are elevating yourself over. This is harmful because this challenges God. God made each one of us in His image, and He alone is holy. He alone is the one who is innately over all. If I try to claim, either to myself or overtly to you, that I am over you, I am better than you for whatever reason, then that's basically a convoluted way of trying to put myself in the place of God. Now that ought to make us a little bit uncomfortable, a lot uncomfortable. We don't want to make that claim, and while it might seem like that is quite a leap to jump from this point to that point, that's Hannah's point here, to show that they are the same. Now, we can be clear that differences do exist among people, but the significance of those differences is not as severe as we would like to believe, especially in terms of value and worth. So do not be arrogant. Do not speak proud words. And an additional reason given for this is that the Lord is a God of knowledge, and He weighs our actions. Here's the challenge for us. God knows what you think. He knows what you really think about your brethren, about the people in your community, your neighbors, the people all around you. He knows why you do what you do. And if you value yourself over other people, you might be able to hide that, though I would argue that that's harder to hide than you might think. You might be able to hide that, though, at least for a time. But God will never be fooled. God knows exactly how much value and worth you attach to yourself. And if you think He's amused by your self-inflated worth, let me assure you that He is not. Let that humble you and build attitudes of empathy and service rather than arrogance. Well, let's keep reading verses 4 through 7. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who are full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and He exalts. We have a tendency to believe that our place in life is unchangeable, that our place is set, or at least is on a constant upward trend. And that's true whether you're talking about power or wealth or family or your life itself, that wherever I'm at now, I'm going to stay at that point, if not get better as time goes on. And so by this time next year, I'll have more money than I do today. In 10 years, I'll have a lot more money than today, or power, or my family will grow, or I will be, healthier. I will have, more enjoyment out of life. I'll be farther along in my career. I'll be more respected in my community. I'll have more skills and talents. Life will be better the more time goes on. What if it's not? Do you consider that perspective, that your life may not be better tomorrow than it is today? What if your life gets worse? What if you lose position? That's unthinkable. That's impossible to imagine, yet it happens all the time. All these things that we count on are fleeting. The mighty can become weak, and vice versa. The rich can become poor, and the poor can rise up. The barren woman can gain a large family, while the mother of many can lose hers. Even our very lives are not guaranteed. Our health, our life, it can be here today and be gone tomorrow. I just got word that a friend of mine, she's a couple years younger than I am, is battling cancer. And I don't want to think about people younger than me battling cancer. That can't happen. Cancer's not for people my age. Until it is. What do you do about that? What do you do about the uncertainty of life? Life is sometimes so fragile, and at other times it is so resilient. All of this tells us not to put too much stock in our current place. Whatever it is that you presently have can be taken away in a blink of an eye, and whatever it is that you lack may be given to you when you least expect it. With all this in mind, is it worth elevating myself over you because of something that I might not even have tomorrow? Think about that. You have more money than another person, and so that makes you better. What happens if the money's gone? What happens if you lose it? You think that you are better because you are healthier. What if you're not? All these things can change. And that uncertainty should lead us not to put our confidence and our hope in those things, but instead in God. Now, in verse 8, 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 8, Hannah says, "He raises up the poor from dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world." Do not get the idea that God simply acts on whim to raise and lower us. The view we got from verses 4 through 7 is that everything is in flux and you can gain and lose things in a heartbeat, and it's all just, the spin of a wheel, or God just deciding, today you're a millionaire, tomorrow you're broke, as if he's just toying with us and playing with us. That's not the impression that I want you to have. There are a lot of things going on, and some things are random, and probably many more things appear to be random, but are actually part of much larger purposes and movements and phenomena that we just don't see from our perspective. Now, some of those things that happen to us can be because God made them happen, or they can just be the chain reactions of all sorts of decisions that we made and that other people have made throughout our lives and even before our lives. Yet there's a shift away here in verse 8 from the acknowledgement that changes in life position can happen to anyone to this new focus on how God has particular care for the lowly. God is not just toying with us. He cares in particular for those who have a low position. He raises up the poor and needy. He gives them a seat of honor and power. And I'm inclined to think here that in this transition, we're beginning to talk less about physical, earthly position, although that can be in mind. Verses 4 through 7 showed that. But verse 8 is less about God saying, I'm going to take the poor and make them rich, and now they're the rich, so I got to take the new poor and make them rich, and do this weird, endless cycle. And instead showing that God cares about the humble. God cares about the lowly, not just in position and power, but those who have made themselves lowly. in humility and service. This is a prophetic word about the exaltation that God has in store for the faithful. And I think that becomes clearer in the conclusion of this song as we get to the last couple verses. We've moved from the randomness and the uncertainty into a deliberate plan God has to take the lowly, to take the humble faithful, and to raise them up. Read with me verses 9 and 10. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. The final stanza of Hannah's song makes it abundantly clear where this is all heading. God will guard and defend his faithful servants. The wicked, by contrast, will be shattered and cut off. There's no amount of strength that will save them. It is Yahweh's place to judge and to give victory, and he will not be idle. He will not stand by and do nothing. So to look at Hannah's song from a step back, to see it at a glance, it begins at what God has done, and as you go deeper into it, it moves into what God will do. So Hannah rejoices because of what God has done for her, because of what God does for others, and then she rejoices because of what God will do for the humble, the lowly, to raise up those who have humbled themselves before God. There's one other thing that's going to set up a lot of narrative importance to Samuel, to the book of Samuel. And that's this concept of the Lord's anointed. Notice the very end of verse 10. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. It's a really interesting thing to say in a time when Israel did not have a king other than God. And there's some debate in the world of religious scholars as to whether Hannah said that in that moment or whether this part was added later. And some think that it's possible that as this prayer was taken as a song and it was something that Hannah would have continued to sing and others would have sung, that it evolved a little bit over time, and that's possible. It's also possible that this is prophetic, that she is looking forward to a change that is getting ready to happen within the nation of Israel. This concept of God's anointed becomes very important on multiple levels. One, as you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel, you learn the story about how Israel gets kings, how they transition from having these judges who are there to resolve disputes and to provide some spiritual guidance into actually getting bona fide civil government, getting kings to rule over them, and God trying to warn them that this is not what I have in mind for you, this is not what I want for you, but you continue to insist that this is what you want. So recognize the ramifications of this, and if you still want that, then I will give you a king of my choosing. And you're about to learn a whole lot of things about what a king is through Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. 3 very different men who have some different strengths and weaknesses. They all show some good things about God's power and some bad things about man's weakness. But they prove instructive to the people of Israel. It does generally get worse from there as the kings progress. But all of that contrasts very nicely with a further iteration of this concept of God's anointed. And that's the real anointed one of God, the one who has been anointed King of Kings, the one who has been exalted, the one who has been raised up to rule over all creation. And that's Jesus Christ. We're going to see all these things so much more in next week's lesson and the week after that as well, when we look at David's song at the end of 2 Samuel and the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1. I encourage you to be here for those and to see how this builds as we go. But remember the things that we've learned today. Trust in the Lord. Humble yourself before the Lord. Remember that you can pray to Him, and He will often answer your prayer and grant you what you have asked. And when He does, rejoice in that and be thankful. But do not elevate yourself over anyone else. God alone is holy. God alone has the nature of holiness because He is innately above all creation. We are thankful for what God has done and what He will do as we look forward to our glorification. Thank you, brethren and friends. We give you the opportunity to come to the Lord and to make your request known. If you're ready to be baptized, we're ready to help you. If you don't know what that means, we're happy to explain that to you, to show you from Scripture what God has in store for you, what His plan for you is, what He commands you to do, but also what He promises to you. And so ask those questions, and we'd be happy to show you from Scripture what God has in mind. Whatever it is we can help you with, please come forward as together we stand and sing.